the College Republicans United for inviting me here and persevering in the face of all the opposition and, dare I say, hatred you have faced in trying to arrange something like this. And there's plenty of that out there. I'd like to express my appreciation for Arizona State University. The administration, I understand, came under very considerable pressure trying to get this event canceled, and they held firm. That's unusual these days. If you all are tuition-paying students, you can be proud of your university. Of course, there are people who do not welcome freedom of speech. I haven't had the opportunity that I was looking forward to meet the ladies and gentlemen outside, but for them, I have the greatest contempt. They're not interested in debating. They're interested in only one thing: shutting people up who disagree with them. Now, you would think that if I am as vile as they describe, so unhinged, so ignorant, they should welcome every opportunity for me to speak, because the guardians of orthodoxy can listen to the ravings of this idiot Jared Dare and go home fortified in their own wisdom and their own virtue. Wouldn't that be the case? But no, they would rather none of them have an opportunity to hear what I have to say. What are they going to fear? What are they afraid of? They're probably afraid that they might learn something. That would be a great, disgusting, and disgraceful experience for them. In any case, I'm delighted to be here. And the first subject I'd like to talk about is the reality of race. I'm sure you've heard over and over again the fashionable view that race is not biology. It is some kind of sociological optical illusion. It's described as a social construct. And theoretically, it's something that 17th century wicked white men invented as an excuse for oppressing other people, and nobody in the whole world had ever noticed race before. This is just so obviously wrong and so obviously stupid that I often say the only people who could possibly convince themselves that race is an illusion are very intelligent people, because anybody with the least amount of common sense recognizes that it's a biological phenomenon. I mean, after all, babies, 3-month-old babies, can tell race apart. And it's not as though they are dealing with a social construct. They can't even talk. Social constructs are put together by human beings in the form of words and speech. They are not something that babies have any sense of at all. And were you all aware of the fact that people of different races have different patterns of bacteria that live in your mouths? Did you all know? Probably not. It's sort of an obscure thing that people like me dig up. But with 90% accuracy, you can determine somebody's race simply by looking at the pattern of bacteria living in his mouth. Now, are those bacteria being hoodwinked by some sort of social construct? No. They are reacting to a biological reality. Just the same way, 23andMe and Ancestry.com, with just a few drops of saliva, can tell right down to the percentage what race you are and also what nationality you are. The idea, again, that biological race is some sort of hypnotic effect that wicked white people have wielded on the entire world, I just don't know how something so spectacularly stupid could have gotten the wide circulation it has. We are to imagine, I suppose, that when the Japanese first saw Europeans coming out of those strange black ships, were they really saying to themselves, gee, they look just like us. That guy looks like Uncle Tanaka. No. They were saying, what in heaven's name is this? Where did these freaks come from? We know very well how they react because they wrote their reactions down. They had never seen such strange creatures. They were not reacting to social conflict. In 1970, I spent a fair amount of time traveling in West Africa. And in the Ivory Coast, I was in some rather obscure little villages where they hadn't seen many white men. And the toddlers never had seen them. And the adults took great pleasure pushing them up to me, little 2 years old. And they would look at me and scream. I was an absolute freak to them. They would scream and run away, and the adults thought that was hilarious. I thought it was rather cruel, actually. They'd catch them and push them again, and tears running down their faces. But those children were not reacting to a social conflict. Again, the idea that race is some sort of invention of wicked white people. You know, one of the earliest expressions of race goes back 3,500 years to an Egyptian funerary document called the Book of Gates. The Book of Gates, 1,500 BC. And they very carefully and explicitly lay out the four races of which they were aware at the time. That was Egyptians, Nubians, Libyans, and Asiatics. And they depict them with different skin colors, different facial features, and they call them four races. Now, needless to say, the races have different physical characteristics. Skin color is one of the least important of them. But they differ in hair texture, shape of the face, shape of the skull. In fact, if you gave a child of two a basket full of skulls of Aboriginals, of Australian Aborigines and East Asians, he could sort them as easily as sorting cucumbers and zucchinis. They are very different. Frequencies of blood type, for example, frequencies of disease. There is a prescription drug called Bidil for blood pressure that the FDA has approved only for black people because it works only on black people. And yet, we're supposed to somehow think that race is a social construct. Race, of course, is the equivalent of what we call subspecies in animals. Subspecies is something that happens when you have a species in which different members of that species get separated from each other and evolve in a different environment, and they come up with different formation, different behavior patterns. Take, for example, tigers. There are 9 subspecies of tigers. The Sumatran, the Javan, the Siberian, the Bengal tiger. This is all very well recognized in biology. And human races are subspecies. This is what you get when you have different groups that have evolved separately, in some cases over 200,000 years, in different environments, being shaped both physically and psychologically in different ways to suit their environment. That's why in hot areas you have tall people, like East Africans, more body surface for cooling. In cold areas, Eskimos are short and stockier so they can maintain body heat. The same is true for adaptations to high altitude. So you can breathe in thinner air. East Africans and also people who grew up in the Andes, developed in the Andes, they have 2 separate biological mechanisms for dealing more efficiently in thin air. None of this stuff is some kind of social construct. Again, the idea that this is the case is just preposterous. Now, I'll get into an aspect of race that some people find disagreeable. And that's not just the kind of obvious differences we see, for example, in athletic performance. As you know, in the sprints, West Africans dominate. They can be living in the United States or in Britain or wherever it is, but the final 100-meter dash in the Olympics, I think you go back for 10 years before you can find a non-West African. East Africans dominate the distance sports, the marathon, the 10,000 meters. These things reflect evolved differences. And just like the Bengal tiger as opposed to the Siberian tiger, human groups evolving in different environments over generation after generation after generation have evolved the obvious physical differences that we see every day. They've also evolved differences in intelligence. Intelligence is the most carefully studied human trait in all of psychology. People have tried to study it, understand it, measure it, understand its nature for over 100 years, and they have succeeded very well. Intelligence is something that is well defined, it's something that can be measured, and in all of these attempts to measure it, scientists have tried very, very hard to eliminate any kind of bias that would discriminate against one group over And the consequences, again, these results are consistent for the last 100 years. In the United States, whites have an average IQ of 100, blacks have an average IQ of about 85, East Asians have an average IQ of 103 to 105, and Hispanics, there's a very mixed population, it's hard to generalize, but they fall somewhere between whites and blacks. So we have a very consistent pattern in terms of the spread of IQ. Now these are average patterns, which is obviously not to say that every East Asian is smarter than every white, or that every white is smarter than every black. No, they're very smart people of all races, and very stupid people of all races. Some of those outside. My point is, averages are not the same. And I will describe some of these differences in somewhat graphic terms. If the average white IQ is 100, that means 50% of whites have an IQ above 100, 50% have an IQ below 100. With an average IQ of 85, blacks, only 16% have an IQ of 100 or higher. That means whites are about 3 times more likely to have an IQ 100 and higher than a black. In the case of being able to make a really serious intellectual contribution to society, any cognitively demanding job in the area of about IQ of 125, white people are about 30 times more likely to have an IQ at that level than black people. It's not to say there are no black people who have IQs at that level. It's just that there are very few in number. On the other hand, East Asians are twice as likely as whites to have IQs at that level. So the idea that every racial group in America is going to be equally represented in every field of endeavor that requires intelligence is completely crazy. It is futile to build a society on the idea that that is the kind of result you're going to get. And that, of course, is absolute dogma in the United States today. There are actual physical correlates of these differences. And that has to do with brain size. Brain size has a correlation of about 0.3 or 0.4 with intelligence. It's not a one-to-one correlation. But people of different races, again on average, have different amounts of brain, believe it or not. MRI imaging can detect the size and quantity of brain matter very, very accurately. As it turns out, Asians have about 1 cubic inch more brains on average than Europeans. Europeans have about 3 inches on average more than blacks. Now, this is, as I said before, an unpleasant subject. I wish it were one that I did not have to talk about, but as I'll explain later, we are forced to talk about this. But we see the consequences every day. There are about 13,000 school districts in the United States, 13,000. And in every one of them, the pattern of standardized scores and grades is always the same. Asians at the top, followed by white, followed by Hispanics, followed by blacks. Why is that? Is that because in every one of these 13,000 school districts, American society is conspiring in some sort of white supremacist way to keep non-whites at the bottom, and somehow the Asians filter through to the top? Is that how it's working out? Somehow, coincidentally, all of these social forces are working to produce the same result. No. Isn't the obvious solution, isn't the obvious reason that you just cannot expect the same average result for each racial group? This is simple. It's not complicated. But by refusing to recognize this, we have stood our society entirely on its head and have devoted a tremendous amount of resources on trying to get equal results, which is a futile undertaking. There's another aspect to racial differences that's worth talking about as well. Intelligence is one thing. Intelligence is very highly correlated with success in life. You're more likely to make money, more likely to get married and stay married, less likely to end up in jail. less likely to be poor. It's not a guarantee, but the smarter you are, the less likely you are to have the most unfortunate life outcomes. But intelligence isn't everything. There's also something called deferral of gratification. It's the ability to sacrifice now in the name of the future. If you've got a big biology test next day and somebody invites you to a party, you have to be prepared to say, no, it's more important that I sacrifice today because it's important that I get a good grade on that biology test because I want to go to medical school. If you're unable to save money for the future and spend it all, if you are unable to do things that may be unpleasant now that will give a reward in the future, you are going to be less successful in life. And this ability to defer gratification, it is not equally mixed either among the races. And there's a very simple and interesting test. It's called the marshmallow test. Just out of curiosity, how many of you all have heard of the marshmallow test? Oh gosh, I'm singing to the choir here. This is no good. I like to talk to people who don't already know everything I was going to say in advance. But the way it is, the way the marshmallow test works, if you give, say, a 6-year-old boy or a girl one marshmallow, you say, I'm going to come back in 15 minutes, and if you have not eaten this marshmallow, I'll give you another marshmallow. But if I come back in 15 minutes and you've already eaten this marshmallow, too bad for you, that's all you can get. And so if you are able to defer gratification and sit there and look at that marshmallow on video, it's really quite interesting the way you see these children struggling with the desire to eat that marshmallow. Some of them will stare at it, and pick it up. And some of them just want to look the other way. It's a terrible struggle not to eat that marshmallow. But if they succeed, then they get to eat 2 marshmallows. Well, again, there's the same standard racial pattern we see there. Asians are better able to defer gratification than whites. I've never seen any data on Hispanics. I'm sorry. I suspect they would fall somewhere in the middle, and then blacks are least able to defer gratification. So, why is any of this important? It's important because the way the United States works today, the way the entire world works today, is that the only acceptable explanation for racial differences in achievement has to do with white privilege, white supremacy, wickedness of whites. And so, if blacks are not doing as well economically, not doing as well in school, more likely to be in jail, more likely to commit crime, all of this, in one way or another, must be blamed on whites, because that is the only acceptable explanation. And so, part of the title of my talk has to do with white identity politics. This is because whites have legitimate interests that must be defended. And one of those legitimate interests is not to be blamed for things that are their fault. And today, if any non-white group does not succeed at the same level of whites, who's to blame? White. Whitey from the past, whitey from today, and whitey for the future forever and ever and ever. It is always whitey's fault. Now again, the whole question of Asians. Asians make more money than whites. They're less likely to go to jail. They're less likely to have illegitimate children. In all objective, measurable ways, you could say that Asians are, according to all these standards, superior to whites. How come they are somehow able to defeat this white supremacist, white privilege system and float to the top? How do they do it? It's very simple, because there is no white supremacist system. There is no institutional racism. All of these new ideas we've come up with, systemic racism, somehow the system is racist, somehow the institutions are racist. This is what people are stuck with when they can't find actual human beings who they think are getting up in the morning and spitting on their hands and rubbing their hands together and rolling up their sleeves and saying, how am I going to hurt black people today? There's nobody in America doing that. Nobody. And therefore, because such people do not exist, all the people who insist that it's all white's fault have to fall back on this kind of miasma this strange thing that emanates from the walls of institution. What the heck could that even possibly be? Institutionalist. Either you have people or systems that discriminate, or you don't. And to say somehow that the system discriminates. No, the system doesn't discriminate. The system sorts people out according to their ability. Asians get to the top because they are hardworking, smart. And that somehow doesn't refute the idea that all whites are pathetically wicked. Now, it seems to me that one of the most spectacular examples of this attribution to whites of almost a superpower in terms of their ability to oppress black people is the slogan, "White silence is violence." You all remember that one? During the Black Lives Matter riots? White silence is violence. What does that mean? That means, presumably, that unless white people are constantly making some sort of anti-racist, pro-black noise, they are committing violence against blacks. My goodness, are they committing violence against blacks in their sleep? White people don't have superpowers like that. No. This is just cuckoo. It used to be, back in the 1950s and the 1960s, during the Civil Rights era, that the idea of America was, yes, we are going to tear down all these barriers that have been put in the face of non-whites, and we're all going to dismantle white racial consciousness, and we're all just going to be Americans. That was the whole idea of the 1950s and the 1960s. And there were barriers. There were barriers to black success. They were all legally abolished. And whites, by and large, kept their end of the bargain. They said, okay, we're going to try to treat people equally. We have no malice against anyone. So our ideal is to treat everyone the same, regardless of race. Well, no, that's not good enough, apparently. No, that's colorblind racism. White people are oppressing non-whites, whether they consciously wish to or not. What kind of foolishness is this? You can imagine how confused and angry white people are to be told that, no, you're just inherently racist. Basically, breathing the air makes you racist. Every time you turn around, you're oppressing non-whites. This is crazy. And in fact, this is exactly what people like Robin DiAngelo and some of these other anti-racist gurus will tell you, that white people can never be non-racist. They can be anti-racist. They can devote their entire lives to dismantling this white supremacy that they find everywhere, that I sure can't find. But they can never actually achieve this state of not being racist, because they're white. What more contemptuous and racist, if you will, attitude could there possibly be? But this is the fault, the perpetual fault of white people. Now, if the United States wanted to devise a way to try to teach black people to hate white people, this is exactly what they would come up with. They would say to black people, well, of course, you're just as smart as hardworking. Absolutely. Just as smart, just as hardworking, always have been. And the reason that you're not doing as well, it's those folks over there, those white people. It's the white folks from 100 years ago. It's a white man sitting next to you on the bus. It's all those white people who are enjoying white privilege and who are unconsciously propping up white supremacy. It's those people who are keeping you down. What better way to teach black people to hate white people? And the fact is, it's remarkably more than that, given this incessant insistence that nothing is their fault. Now, some people say that you shouldn't talk about racial differences in IQ, racial differences in ability, because that would be insulting. I think it's equally insulting not to talk about these things. Why is that? Because for all of us, part of growing up and becoming an adult is the realization that you're not the smartest, or the fastest, or the most beautiful, or the best looking. You are not absolutely top in every respect. And sometimes, if the other guy wins, it's because because he was better. He did a better job. That's part of becoming an adult. What we are saying to black people is, you never get to grow up. You have to spend your entire life not realizing that sometimes some of the guys get to do a better job than you because you worked harder because you're smart. We're saying black people don't grow up. You can blame your failures on other people from now until eternity. No. The only way that you can have any kind of satisfactory understanding of the way the world works is understanding that you rise and fall almost entirely according to your own efforts. Now, another thing, what are white interests are? One, as I said before, is not to be blamed for things that are not our fault. Another is for whites not to become a minority in the country that their ancestors built. As you all know, we have an immigration policy that eventually will reduce whites to minority. It wasn't always that way. Until 1965, we had an immigration policy designed to keep the country majority white. And what was wrong with that? Every nation that you can think of, actually, takes it for granted that the people who founded that nation are going to remain a majority. If, for example, there were hundreds of thousands of white people pouring across the border into Mexico, and they were buying up radio stations and broadcasting in English, newspapers publishing in English, insisting on being taught English in school, and maybe there was the equivalent of something like Mecha that was saying, okay, if enough white people show up in some part of Mexico, we're going to break it off and have an all-white republic, such that Mexicans are going to become a minority. You think you could trick the Mexicans into thinking that was cultural division? No way, no way. Mexicans want Mexico to stay Mexican. And God bless them. They have that absolute right. Or imagine if you went to China and you said, you Chinese, you got a pretty good country going here, but you know your problem? Too damn many Chinese. We need diversity. China would just do so much better with a couple of million Pakistanis. A bunch of Ethiopians. And get Albanians. Albanians will really ginger you up. They call for the men in the white coats. They think you were cuckoo, and you would be cuckoo, and you would be deeply insulting to them. And yet, we have people from all around the world who come to this country, and they seem to claim that their presence is what makes America great. We're supposed to celebrate their arrival. I guess white people in the 1950s were about to choke to death on their own poisonous homogeneity until these people came from all around the world and saved us from ourselves and built this wonderful nation we now live in today. Oh, it's something. And yet you hear that from people. Yes, we brought you diversity. They didn't bring diversity. They came because they came from failed countries and they want to enjoy the benefits of a country that was built by Europeans. That's why they're here. I'm here to give some sort of inestimable gift of diversity. And diversity, of course, is not a strength in any country. It's a source of weakness, constant tension. Think of all the battling that goes on in this country because of multiracial. It is a constant, never-ending strain. Were there enough Hispanics in this group? Are there enough black astrophysicists? And not just that, but look at what happened in 2020. The worst riots in the history of the country. 300 cities we had to call out curfews. 30 states had to call out the national guard. All of this because it was multiracial. None of that would have happened in a racially homogeneous country. And yet we're supposed to walk around like hypnotic robots saying diversity is not just our strength, but it's our greatest strength. Really? What does it produce? I mean, is it, I don't know. You think the way people talk about diversity, that if you took just the right number of maybe blacks, Hispanics, and Asians, and you threw in a few Buddhists and nudists and fruit juice drinkers and one-legged lesbians and Ethiopians, and put them all in one room, they would cure cancer, wouldn't they? Isn't diversity great? Wouldn't they? I mean, that's sure the way people talk about diversity. No. This stuff is just as cuckoo as saying that racism is an optical illusion. But these are the kind of idiotic, self-hypnotic mantras that the country runs on. And it can't continue. Now, what is the solution? Solutions are very common. But I will suggest to you a certain form of solution. And we find it right here at Arizona State University. And what form does this solution take? It takes the form of recognizing that people are generally much happier and more comfortable among people like themselves. I could be wrong on some of these classifications, but it looks to me as though at this university there are no fewer than 24 Black or African affinity groups, including such things as the Black Student Union, Black African Coalition, Black Artists and Designers, etc., 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 etc. 24 of them. 24. How about Hispanic Latino? There are 27 of them. Hispanic Organization of Latin Awareness, El Concilio, Mi Cultura, Latinos Education University, 27 of them, over and over and over and over. And by my count, at least 19 broadly Asian Pacific, Southeast Asian American Student Association, Korean American Student Association. Anything for white people? Absolutely not. But why are there all of these associations? They're there because people recognize that they're more comfortable around people like this. And even white people feel the same way. But if white people express that view, somehow, unlike in the case of every other group, that is hatred, that is supremacy, that's Nazism, and it's got to be squashed. No, we can't go on this way. This is an absolute notion. The idea, of course, that we're supposed to, white people are supposed to welcome diversity. Welcoming diversity means welcoming people who are unlike us. Welcoming our displacement as a majority, welcoming our elimination as a cultural factor in this country, ultimately welcoming our elimination completely. Why would any healthy people do that? Again, if you look at any nation in the world, if you told the Chinese, look, as I said, too many Chinese, you all need to eliminate yourselves. Crazy, crazy. Any non-white nation takes it for granted that they deserve to exist forever. It's only whites. If you were to find a Frenchman who says, I think French should be French, or a German who says Germany should be for the Germans. Oh, no, that's out off Hitler all over again. Only white people are not allowed to have their own associations, their own countries, their own expressed preference for their own people. Only white people. And we refuse to accept that. So, won't talk very much about it in its own hands. And certainly, if it has built something, an institution, a nation, a community that they have received from their ancestors, they deserve to keep it. And they are under no obligation to give it away. So the solution to all of these problems is the recognition of two things. One is that not every racial group is going to perform at the same level. This is fundamental to understanding a multiracial society. And then the second solution is to understand that sometimes differences are irreconcilable. We have had a multiracial country here for hundreds of years. How well is it working? If this were a marriage, it would be considered irreconcilable differences, grounds for divorce. It's only by people going their own way that they will ever find any solution to these utterly intractable problems. And with that, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Fucking Nazi now! Go back to LLC, you precious motherfucker!